The morning was a disaster in every sense. My wife, Madison, stormed into the kitchen in her robe, her phone in one hand, and a frantic expression on her face. I was pouring my coffee, half listening to the usual chaos she carried into a room. "Bryce, my car won't start," she barked, her manicured nails tapping furiously on her phone screen. I looked up from my coffee. "Did you try calling someone? Maybe Kyle next door could jumpstart it." She rolled her eyes like I was the idiot here. "Kyle? Really? He can't even fix his lawnmower. This is serious. I've got that client meeting in 2 hours. I'll just call a tow truck and take it to a service station. This is gonna cost a fortune, I bet." I shrugged. Madison had been driving her aging BMW like it was still brand new. I'd been telling her for months to trade it in for something reliable. But Madison had this thing about appearances. She wanted the sleek luxury even when practicality was screaming louder. "Whatever it costs," I replied, sipping my coffee. "Just make sure they don't overcharge you." She didn't hear me. Her thumbs were already working overtime, likely texting someone about her. Crisis. The car was towed to a local service station on the edge of town, the kind of place I'd always driven by but never noticed. Madison was furious when she learned she'd have to go there in person to approve the estimate. Later that afternoon, she returned from the service station, her cheeks flushed pink, her lipstick noticeably freshened. Something about her energy was different. She was in a better mood than I'd seen her in weeks. She handed me a piece of paper with the repair estimate, and I nearly choked on my sandwich. $5,000? What the hell are they fixing? Turning your car into a rocket ship? Madison leaned against the counter, a sly smile tugging at her lips. "Apparently it's more serious than I thought. The mechanic said the engine might need replacing soon, too. He showed me everything under the hood. It's a mess." "Great. So we're dropping half of our savings into this car because you love the badge on the front," I muttered. She didn't flinch at my sarcasm. If anything, her smile grew wider. "Oh, Bryce, it's just money. Besides, it's not like you've been driving me to work." The way she said it was off, but I let it go. She flitted out of the kitchen before I could press further. That night, Madison spent hours texting on her phone, giggling at something I wasn't privy to. She said it was work-related, but I had this sinking feeling it wasn't just spreadsheets making her laugh. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it yet, but the air between us felt thicker, heavier. A couple of days later, Madison announced she needed to return to the service station to check on the repairs. It didn't make much sense to me. Why would she need to be there in person again? But I was already knee-deep in work deadlines and didn't have the energy to argue. "They need me to sign off on the replacement parts," she explained, smoothing out her fitted white blouse and adjusting her skirt in the hallway mirror. "You know how these things go." I didn't actually, but I just nodded. "Why are you so dressed up?" I asked, eyeing the heels she'd slipped on. "It's a service station, not some gala." She smirked as she grabbed her purse. "Well, Bryce, it never hurts to look presentable, does it?" Something about her tone gnawed at me, but I didn't push. By the time she got home that evening, it was nearly dark. I'd cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just spaghetti, and set it on the counter to stay warm. "Everything good with the car?" I asked as she walked through the door, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly out of place. She mumbled, distracted as she slid off her heels. "Oh, yeah? The repairs are coming along fine. It's gonna take a bit longer, though. They're waiting on a part to be delivered. You were gone for hours." She froze for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she shrugged and breezed past me to grab a glass of wine. "It's complicated, Bryce. You wouldn't understand. Besides, it's not just the repairs. I had to wait around for the mechanic to explain everything to me." "Sounds like a full-on seminar," I said dryly. She turned to face me, glass in hand. "You know, you could have come with me if you're so interested in how long I was there." I shook my head, not wanting to start something. But that sinking feeling from a few days ago crept back. The next morning, I couldn't shake the weird vibe. Madison had been unusually chipper all night, almost giddy. I was curious. No, more than curious. I was suspicious. So when I finished my morning coffee, I decided to take a little drive to the service station myself. The place wasn't anything special, just a nondescript garage with 3 bays and a small office at the front. I parked across the street and watched as cars came and went, mechanics in grease-stained uniforms moving in and out of the bays. Eventually, I walked in, pretending to inquire about a different repair. A young guy at the front desk was polite enough, but I wasn't paying much attention to him. My eyes scanned the room until they landed on a man walking out from the back. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and rugged in a way that felt intentional. His coveralls clung to him, unzipped slightly at the front to reveal a white t-shirt that was smeared with oil and sweat. He looked like someone straight out of a damn calendar. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "No, just looking around," I said quickly, feeling a strange tension settle in the air. He nodded and headed back into the garage, but I couldn't help noticing the way he moved, confident, almost cocky. And for some reason, I could imagine Madison finding that very appealing. When I got home, I asked Madison about the mechanic. "Is he younger?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She raised an eyebrow. "Why do you ask?" "I just stopped by the station earlier. I wanted to check on things." Her face froze for the briefest moment before she forced a laugh. "Oh, Bryce, you don't have to worry about all that. I've got it under control." "Didn't answer my question?" She took a sip of her coffee, her smile tight. "Yes, he's younger. Does it matter?" I let it go, but I couldn't shake the image of that mechanic and the way she'd acted the night before. Something wasn't right. The unease in my gut wasn't going away. Madison had been acting different, lighter, almost glowing, but not in the way you'd expect from someone happy at home. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite name but could feel every time she walked into a room. A week after her second trip to the service station, she told me she needed to go back yet again. "This is ridiculous," I said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "Why can't they just call you or email you about these repairs? Do they really need you there in person every time?" Madison barely glanced up from her phone. "Bryce, I've explained this. The repairs are complicated, and I need to authorize some things. It's not like I'm enjoying hanging around a greasy garage." Her tone was clipped, defensive. That only made my suspicion deepen. "You sure about that?" I said, my voice lower. Her eyes snapped up to mine, narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I muttered, waving it off. "Go do whatever you need to do." She stood there for a moment, glaring at me, before grabbing her purse and storming out the door. I couldn't just sit there this time. My mind was running in circles, and the only way to quiet it was to get answers. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. When I arrived at the service station, I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance. I didn't want her to see me. The bays were wide open, and I could see the mechanics working on cars, their movements efficient and practiced. But it wasn't hard to spot Madison. She was leaning against her BMW, chatting with the same broad-shouldered mechanic I'd noticed last time. He stood close, too close, his hands gesturing animatedly as he talked. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back, the sunlight catching in her hair. It wasn't just the way they were talking, it was the energy between them. The way her body leaned slightly toward him, the way his eyes lingered on her longer than they should. My stomach twisted. I watched as he moved closer, brushing his hand against her arm. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled in a way I hadn't seen her smile at me in months. I clenched my fists at my sides, fighting the urge to storm in and demand answers. But I knew better. If I confronted her now, she'd just deny it, make me feel like I was imagining things. So I stayed in my car, watching as they continued their little performance. After about 20 minutes, Madison climbed into her car, but she didn't leave right away. The mechanic leaned down to her window, saying something I couldn't hear. She giggled and nodded before finally driving off. I stayed parked for a few more minutes, my heart pounding and my mind racing. That night, I tried to act normal, but it was impossible. Madison came home, chipper as ever, and went straight to the bathroom to shower. When she came out, her phone was sitting on the counter, unlocked. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed it. I scrolled through her messages, my fingers trembling slightly. Most of it looked normal, texts from her mom, her friends, work. But then I saw it. A thread with someone saved under. Mike. I opened it. The first thing I saw was a message from him. I can't stop thinking about this afternoon. You're incredible. The blood drained from my face. Her response. I can't stop thinking about it either. You have no idea what you've done to me. My hands shook as I scrolled up. The messages were all there, flirty, explicit, and undeniable. She was having an affair. With him. The damn mechanic. I locked the phone and set it back on the counter before she came back into the room. My mind was spinning, my stomach in knots, but I forced myself to act calm. How's the car coming along? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. She smiled, oblivious. Oh, it's fine. They should be done soon. It's taking longer than I expected, but it's worth it to get it done right. Right, I said, nodding. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying everything in my mind. The way she'd been acting, the texts, the moments I'd ignored because I didn't want to believe it. The truth was staring me in the face now. My wife was cheating on me. The next morning, I couldn't look at Madison without feeling sick. Her cheerful demeanor, the way she hummed while sipping her coffee, it all felt like a slap in the face. She didn't even try to hide the fact that she was happy. Happy, while I was drowning in the knowledge of her betrayal. I didn't say much as she went through her usual morning routine. She kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, a kiss I didn't return. She didn't notice, too busy checking her phone as she walked out the door. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my own phone and dialed the service station. Hey, I said when the guy at the desk picked up. I was wondering if I could get an update on a repair. Madison Harper's BMW. She's my wife. There was a pause. Oh, yeah? That one. Let me check. I waited, my jaw tight, as he rummaged through some papers. Yeah, it's all done, he said finally. What do you mean it's done? I asked, my voice sharp. Finished a couple days ago. She picked it up yesterday. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. Yesterday? Are you sure? Positive. I hung up without saying goodbye, my chest heaving with the weight of what I'd just learned. She'd picked up the car yesterday but told me it wasn't ready. Why would she lie about that? What was she doing instead? The answer was obvious, but it still hit me like a punch to the gut. She'd spent yesterday with him. That evening, I waited for her to come home. I didn't say a word about the car or the service station. Instead, I watched her. I watched the way she flitted around the house like nothing was wrong, the way she smiled at me like I was the fool she'd always counted on me to be. But I wasn't a fool anymore. The next day, I told my boss I needed to leave work early. My plan was simple: follow her. She had mentioned she was meeting a friend for lunch. I didn't buy it. So I parked a few streets away from the house and waited for her to leave. It didn't take long. She came out, looking more put together than I'd seen her in months. A tight blouse, a short skirt, heels, she was dressed like she was going on a date, not meeting a friend. I followed her car, keeping a safe distance as she navigated through town. Sure enough, she wasn't heading to a restaurant or a friend's house. She was heading to the service station. I parked across the street and watched as she pulled into the lot. The mechanic, Mike, was waiting for her, leaning against the hood of a car. She stepped out of her BMW, and he greeted her with a smirk, pulling her into a hug that lasted far too long to be innocent. I could feel the blood rushing to my head, my heart pounding so loudly it was all I could hear. They didn't even go inside the service station. Instead, they got into her car together. She was driving, and he was in the passenger seat. I waited until they pulled out of the lot and started following them again. They drove out of town, down a quiet road lined with trees. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I realized where they were heading, the lake. The lake was a popular spot for teenagers and young couples looking for privacy. It was secluded, far from prying eyes. I parked a little way down the road and got out of my car, careful to stay out of sight. Sure enough, they'd pulled into a small clearing near the water. Her car was parked under the shade of a tree. From where I stood, I could see them through the windshield. They were talking, laughing. Then, suddenly, she leaned across the console and kissed him. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I couldn't stand there any longer. My legs carried me forward before I even realized what I was doing. I came up to the driver's side window and knocked on it hard. Madison jerked back, her eyes wide with shock. Mike froze, his face going pale as he turned to look at me. "Bryce," Madison stammered, scrambling to adjust her skirt. "Get out," I said, my voice cold and even. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Get out," I repeated, not even looking at her. My eyes were locked on Mike. He opened the door and stepped out, his hands raised slightly like he was trying to show he didn't want trouble. "This isn't what it looks like," he said quickly. "Shut up," I snapped. Madison climbed out of the car, her face red and her words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain. "Bryce, please. I don't want to hear it," I said, cutting her off. "I've seen enough." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I turned back to Mike. "You're going to walk away. Right now. And you're never going to speak to my wife again." He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to Madison, before finally nodding. "Yeah. Okay." He started to walk away, but I wasn't done. "Hey." He stopped, turning back to face me. "If I ever see you near her again, you're going to regret it." His eyes widened, and he nodded quickly before disappearing into the woods. I didn't say another word to Madison. I got into my car and drove home, leaving her standing there by the lake. I drove home in silence, my grip on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My thoughts churned in an uncontrollable storm of rage, humiliation, and heartbreak. I had just witnessed my wife, the woman I had trusted with my life, wrapped up in the arms of another man. By the time I got home, the silence of the house felt oppressive. Every corner, every photo on the walls, every little detail reminded me of the life we had built together, now crumbling before my eyes. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, needing something to take the edge off. But the burn in my throat was nothing compared to the fire raging inside me. It was almost 2 hours before Madison came home. When she walked through the door, she looked small, defeated. Her makeup was smudged, and her hair was a mess. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching her purse like a lifeline. I didn't even bother turning around to face her. I just stared into my glass, swirling the amber liquid slowly. "Bryce," she started, her voice trembling. "Please let me explain." "Explain what?" I said, cutting her off. My voice was calm, but there was a razor-sharp edge to it. "Explain why you've been sneaking around with a mechanic? Or explain why you thought I was too stupid to notice?" Her face crumpled, and tears started streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, taking a step closer. "Don't," I said, holding up a hand to stop her. "You don't get to be sorry now, Madison. You made your choices. And you didn't seem very sorry when you were kissing him." She flinched like I'd slapped her, but I didn't care. "I wasn't planning for this to happen," she said, her voice breaking. It just happened." "Bullshit," I snapped, finally standing up. "You don't accidentally just happen to cheat on your husband. You don't just happen to drive out to some lake and throw yourself at some grease-covered jackass. You knew exactly what you were doing." Her tears came harder now, but I wasn't moved. "Not this time." "Was it worth it?" I asked, my voice low. "Was he worth it? All of it? The lies, the sneaking around, throwing away everything we've built. Was he worth that? She shook her head, her sobs choking out her words. I don't know, Bryce. I don't know what I was thinking. I was lonely. You're always so busy, and I just felt invisible. Invisible? I repeated, my voice rising. You felt invisible? So your solution was to screw around behind my back? To destroy our marriage because you couldn't be bothered to talk to me? I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered. I let out a bitter laugh. Well, congratulations. You did. The rest of the night was a blur of shouting, crying, and accusations. Madison begged me to forgive her, to give her another chance. But I couldn't. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said finally, my voice hollow. Bryce, please, she sobbed, grabbing my arm. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. Just don't give up on us. But I couldn't even look at her. I don't think there's an us left to save, I said quietly. I left her crying in the living room and went to the guest room, slamming the door behind me. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and the bitter taste of whiskey still on my tongue. Madison was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. I called off work, she said softly as I walked in. I thought maybe we could talk. I didn't respond. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. Bryce, I know I messed up, she began. But please, let's try to work through this. For us. For our marriage. I stared at her for a long moment, taking in the desperation in her eyes. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally. And even if I could, I don't think I want to. Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I need some time, I said, standing up. Time to think. Time to figure out what I want. Because right now, Madison, I don't think I can be around you without seeing him. I spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, trying to sort through the mess of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, betrayal, sadness, it all blended together into something I couldn't escape. By the time I came home, I had made up my mind. Madison was waiting for me in the living room, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I'm leaving, I said, my voice flat. What? She gasped, standing up. I can't do this, I said, meeting her eyes. I can't be here with you right now. I'll stay at a hotel for a few days while I figure out my next steps. But I'm not staying here. Bryce, please. No, I said firmly. I need space. You've already taken everything else from me, at least give me that. She didn't argue. She just stood there, frozen, as I packed a bag and walked out the door. The hotel room was suffocating. It wasn't just the stale air or the overly bright lights that buzzed overhead, it was the silence. An eerie, oppressive silence that forced me to confront everything I was feeling, the betrayal, the anger, the hollowness inside me. I stared at my phone, half expecting Madison to text or call. A part of me wanted her to fight for this, to prove that I mattered to her. But another part, the louder part, wanted her to stay silent. She didn't call that night. The next day, I met with a lawyer. Her name was Allison Hart, and she came highly recommended. She was sharp, confident, and didn't sugarcoat anything. I want to file for divorce, I said, the words tasting bitter as I spoke them. Allison nodded. I'll need to know everything, Bryce. Do you have evidence of the affair? I hesitated, my stomach turning at the thought of reliving it all. I have text messages, I admitted. I saw them on her phone. And I saw her with him. At the lake. She scribbled notes on her legal pad, her expression unreadable. That's good. It'll help if things get messy. Messy? I asked. Divorces tend to bring out the worst in people, she said simply. Especially when infidelity is involved. Her words stayed with me long after I left her office. I spent the next few days in a haze, going through the motions of work and life while the weight of everything bore down on me. Madison tried to call a few times, but I let the calls go to voicemail. Her messages were all the same, pleas for forgiveness, promises to make things right. But I couldn't believe her. Not anymore. One night, after downing half a bottle of whiskey, I made a decision. If Madison could betray me so easily, why should I hold myself to a higher standard? Why should I stay faithful to someone who had destroyed everything we'd built together? I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I landed on a name, Danielle. Danielle was an old friend from college, someone I'd kept in touch with sporadically over the years. She was divorced now, living a few towns over. I stared at her name for what felt like an eternity before finally sending a message. Hey. It's been a while. Want to catch up? To my surprise, Danielle responded almost immediately. Bryce. Wow, it has been a while. What's up? We exchanged a few messages, keeping things light at first. But as the conversation went on, I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't expected. I told her about Madison, about the affair, about how lost I felt. Danielle was sympathetic, supportive. She told me about her own divorce, about how her ex-husband had cheated on her. We should get together, she said at one point. Have a drink, talk in person. I knew what she was offering. And I knew it wasn't just a drink she had in mind. 2 nights later, I found myself at Danielle's apartment. She greeted me with a warm smile and a hug that lingered a little too long. Her apartment was cozy, with soft lighting and the faint scent of vanilla in the air. She poured us both glasses of wine, and we sat on her couch, talking about everything and nothing. 1 glass turned into 2, then 3. The conversation grew more intimate, our laughter more frequent. At some point she moved closer, her hand resting on my arm. You deserve better, Bryce, she said softly, her eyes locking onto mine. She didn't appreciate you. But I do. Her words felt like a balm for my wounded pride, a validation I hadn't realized I was desperate for. Before I knew it, her lips were on mine, and I didn't stop her. The next morning, I woke up in her bed, the sunlight streaming through the blinds. Danielle was still asleep beside me, her hair splayed out on the pillow. I stared at the ceiling, my stomach churning with a mix of guilt and satisfaction. I had done exactly what Madison had done to me. For a brief moment, I felt like I had reclaimed some of the power she'd stolen from me. But that feeling didn't last. What had I really accomplished? I went back to the hotel later that day, trying to shake off the weight of what I'd done. My phone buzzed with a message from Madison. Can we please talk? I miss you. I deleted the message without responding. But I couldn't ignore the growing pit in my stomach. My own actions were beginning to feel like a betrayal, not of Madison, but of myself. The following day, I went to work, trying to drown myself in routine. But the distractions weren't enough. My mind kept drifting back to Danielle, to Madison, to everything that had led me to this point. I felt like I was spiraling, losing control of everything I thought I knew about myself. That evening, as I sat in my hotel room, staring at the divorce papers Allison had drawn up, I realized something. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days blurred together after my night with Danielle. I couldn't shake the knot of guilt in my chest, even as I told myself it was justified. Madison had started this, hadn't she? She was the one who shattered everything. All I had done was even the score, or so I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I knew I'd crossed a line. A line that I couldn't uncross. Madison hadn't stopped trying to contact me. Every day, there was a new message. Bryce, please call me. I know I messed up, but I love you. We can fix this. Please, just talk to me. I ignored them all. But when I came home one afternoon to grab more clothes, I found her sitting on the couch, waiting for me. She looked like hell. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale and drawn. She wore one of my old sweatshirts, the sleeves pulled over her hands like she was trying to hide inside it. Bryce, she said softly, standing as I walked in. I froze in the doorway, my keys still in hand. What are you doing here? This is my house too, she said quietly. For now, I replied, my voice cold. She flinched, but she didn't back down. We need to talk. I think we've said everything that needs to be said. Please, she begged, stepping closer. Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Fine. 5 minutes. Then I'm leaving. She sat back down on the couch, wringing her hands nervously. I stayed standing, arms crossed, glaring down at her. I'm sorry, she started, her voice trembling. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I am. I've made so many mistakes, Bryce. And I hate myself for it. Good, I said bluntly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she pushed on. I was lonely, okay? I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth. You've been so distant for so long, and I didn't know how to reach you anymore. So you reached out to some guy who knows how to change a tire? I snapped. It wasn't like that, she cried. At least, not at first. I swear. We just talked. He listened to me in a way you haven't in years. Her words hit me like a slap to the face. But I didn't let it show. And then you let him screw you in your car, I said, my voice low and venomous. She broke down sobbing, burying her face in her hands. I made a mistake, she choked out. A horrible, awful mistake. But Bryce, I still love you. I've never stopped loving you. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You have a funny way of showing it. I couldn't listen to her anymore. Her tears, her pleas, they felt like daggers, twisting deeper with every word. I grabbed the bag I'd packed and turned to leave. Bryce, wait, she called, running after me. I stopped at the door, my hand on the knob. What do you want from me, Madison? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You destroyed us. There's no going back from this. I want a chance to make it right, she said, her voice desperate. I'll do anything, Bryce. Please. I turned to face her, my jaw clenched. You can't fix this. You can't undo what you did. But… No! I shouted, cutting her off. It's over, Madison. You had your chance, and you threw it away. Now you get to live with that. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. As I drove back to the hotel, my mind raced. Her words had struck a nerve, but I refused to let them take root. She didn't deserve my forgiveness. But the anger inside me was growing darker, sharper. I didn't just want to walk away from her. I wanted her to feel what I felt, to know what it was like to be betrayed, humiliated, shattered. That night, as I sat in the hotel room, staring at the divorce papers, a plan began to form. The next day, I called Danielle. Hey, she said, her voice warm. I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. I need a favor, I said, my tone serious. Anything, she replied without hesitation. 2 days later, I made my move. I invited Danielle out to dinner, choosing a restaurant I knew Madison loved. It was the kind of place we used to go to on special occasions, fancy, intimate, memorable. We dressed up, Danielle in a sleek black dress that left little to the imagination, and me in the suit Madison had always said was her favorite. The moment we walked in, I spotted Madison. She was sitting at a table near the back with a friend, her eyes widening as soon as she saw us. Perfect. I led Danielle to a table directly in Madison's line of sight. As we sat down, I leaned in close, brushing a strand of hair from Danielle's face and whispering something that made her laugh. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Madison watching us, her face pale and her mouth slightly open. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel regret. All I felt was satisfaction. I didn't think it was possible to feel joy in the middle of a marriage unraveling, but as Madison sat across the room, her stunned expression fueling the fire inside me, I felt a cruel, vindictive kind of satisfaction. Danielle leaned across the table, her hand resting on mine. She played the part perfectly, her laughter chiming like music over the clinking of wine glasses. I kept my eyes locked on hers, but I knew Madison was watching. I wanted her to feel it. I wanted her to burn. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to go to the bathroom, taking the scenic route that led me directly past Madison's table. Her friend looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing the tension, but Madison's eyes shot daggers at me as I approached. "Bryce," she hissed under her breath, leaning forward. I stopped, turning just enough to meet her gaze. "Madison," I said, my voice flat. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Having dinner," I replied, my lips curving into a cold smile. "You!" Her jaw clenched, and I could see the fire behind her eyes. "You're trying to hurt me," she accused. I leaned in slightly, my voice low and sharp. "Funny. That's exactly what I thought when I saw you with your little mechanic friend." Her face flushed red, and for a moment she looked like she might burst into tears or throw her wine at me. But she didn't say anything. Satisfied, I straightened up and walked away, leaving her seething in silence. When I got back to the table, Danielle tilted her head, studying me. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "Perfect," I said, picking up my wineglass. She didn't push, and I appreciated that. For now, she was a pawn in a much bigger game, and she seemed perfectly content to play her role. After dinner, I insisted on walking Danielle to her car, making sure Madison had a clear view of us through the restaurant's wide front windows. I leaned in close as I opened the door for her, brushing her hair back and whispering something that made her laugh again. Madison was still at her table, her eyes locked on us like a hawk. I kissed Danielle, slow and deliberate, before stepping back and watching her drive away. The storm hit when I got home. I wasn't staying at the hotel that night. I had deliberately gone back to the house, knowing Madison would come looking for me. Sure enough, she showed up less than 20 minutes after I walked through the door. She burst in, slamming the door behind her, her face twisted in a mix of rage and pain. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What was what?" I asked, playing dumb as I set my keys on the counter. "You know what I'm talking about, Bryce," she shouted. "Bringing her to my favorite restaurant? Kissing her like that? Are you trying to humiliate me?" I turned to face her, my expression hard. "You mean like you humiliated me? At least I didn't screw Danielle in her car." She flinched at my words, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "I said I was sorry. I'm trying to fix this, Bryce. But you're just trying to hurt me. Is that what you want? To make me feel as bad as you do?" I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Yes, Madison. That's exactly what I want. I want you to feel every ounce of the pain you caused me. I want you to know what it's like to be betrayed, humiliated, destroyed." Her tears spilled over, but I didn't care. "This isn't you," she said, her voice trembling. "You're not this person." "Maybe I wasn't before," I shot back. "But you made me this way." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the texts, the lies, the way she smiled at him. That night, I slept in the guest room again. Madison didn't even try to talk to me when I walked past her. She just sat on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. Part of me wanted to feel bad for her, but I couldn't. Not anymore. The next day, I went to work like nothing had happened. My coworkers could tell something was off, my temper was shorter, my focus scattered, but no one said anything. At lunch, I checked my phone and saw a text from Danielle. "Last night was fun. Let's do it again soon." I stared at the message for a long time, torn between responding and ignoring it. In the end, I decided to leave it unanswered. Danielle had been useful, but I didn't want to drag her into the mess any further. That evening, I found Madison in the kitchen, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. She looked at me as I walked in, but I didn't say anything. "I made dinner," she said quietly. "In case you wanted to eat together." I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and headed to the backyard. As I stood there, staring out at the empty yard, I felt a strange mix of triumph and emptiness. I'd hurt her. I'd made her feel what I felt. But it didn't feel like enough. The satisfaction of humiliating Madison didn't last. The anger simmered beneath the surface, boiling hotter with each passing day. Every time I saw her in the house, her tear-streaked face, the way she tiptoed around me like a ghost, it only fueled the fire. I didn't just want her to feel pain anymore. I wanted to destroy her. The next step in my plan came to me as I sat in my car outside the office, scrolling through my phone. I pulled up her mechanic's name, Mike. His name had burned itself into my mind, and now it was time to learn everything about him. I searched for his name on social media, and sure enough, he had a public profile. Pictures of him at the gym, with friends, even with his dog, a scrappy little mutt named Diesel. But what caught my attention was the occasional picture of a woman. A brunette, slender, always smiling. I clicked through her profile until I found the confirmation I was looking for. Celebrating 5 years with this guy. Love you, Mike! He had a girlfriend. That night, I confronted Madison. She was sitting at the dining room table, staring at a cold plate of food she hadn't touched. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes wary. Who's his girlfriend? I asked bluntly. Her eyes widened in panic. What? Mike. The guy you've been screwing. Who's the woman he's with in all those pictures? His girlfriend? She paled, her fork clattering onto the plate. Bryce, please. Answer the question. I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. Yes. She blurted out, tears streaming down her face. Yes, he has a girlfriend. I didn't think you'd find out. My laugh was sharp and humorless. You didn't think I'd find out about him, period. But here we are. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I stared at her, my chest heaving with anger, then turned and walked away. The next day, I reached out to her. Mike's girlfriend. It didn't take much to find her contact info. She worked at a florist shop downtown. I called her under the pretense of ordering flowers and casually mentioned Mike's name in the conversation. Mike? My Mike? She asked, her tone confused but amused. Yeah, you're Mike, I replied. You might want to sit down for this. We met later that evening at a coffee shop. Her name was Rachel, and she was everything I'd expected, sweet, polite, and completely blindsided. When I told her about Madison and Mike, she froze. For a moment, I thought she might pass out. But then her expression hardened, her jaw tightening as she processed what I was saying. Are you sure? She asked, her voice shaking. I pulled out my phone and showed her the text messages I'd taken screenshots of, as well as a blurry photo I'd snapped of Madison and Mike together at the lake. Rachel's hands trembled as she stared at the evidence. That bastard, she muttered under her breath. Yeah, I said. Now you know how I feel. We sat there for hours, comparing notes and piecing together the timeline of their affair. By the time we left, we had a plan, a way to confront them both and leave them no room to hide. Rachel wanted to handle Mike on her own, but I had a different approach in mind for Madison. The following night, I invited a few friends over, friends who'd known Madison for years. Friends who believed, up until now, that we were the perfect couple. As they sat in the living room, laughing and catching up, Madison walked in, her face lighting up in surprise. What's going on? She asked, glancing between me and the others. Thought it'd be nice to have everyone over, I said casually, pouring myself a drink. Her smile faltered. She wasn't stupid, she could sense the tension. But she didn't say anything. Not yet. After dinner, as the group settled into the living room, I stood up and cleared my throat. There's something I need to share with all of you, I said, my voice steady but cold. Madison's eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. Bryce. She started, but I cut her off. Madison has been having an affair, I said bluntly, looking each of them in the eye. For months now. With a mechanic named Mike. She's lied to me, betrayed me, and destroyed our marriage. The room fell into stunned silence. Madison's face went pale, her hands trembling as she stared at me in disbelief. "Bryce, please," she whispered. "Not like this. This is exactly how it should be," I said, my voice like steel. "You want to tear this family apart? Fine. But I'm not going to let you pretend to be the victim." The rest of the night was chaos. Madison fled the room, sobbing, while my friends sat there, stunned and unsure of what to say. I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. The next morning, I woke up to a slew of text messages and missed calls, some from friends, others from Madison. I ignored them all. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed Rachel. "It's done," I said when she answered. "Good," she replied, her voice cold. "So is mine." I smiled, feeling a dark sense of satisfaction. The divorce moved quickly, thanks to the evidence I had of Madison's affair. Allison had been right. Infidelity gave me the upper hand. I filed for full control of our assets, and Madison didn't have the strength to fight me. By the time the papers were signed, she looked like a shadow of the woman I'd once loved. Her once bright eyes were dull, her confidence shattered. When the day finally came for her to move out, I stood in the doorway, watching as she loaded the last of her belongings into her car. "Bryce," she said, turning to face me. "I'm sorry. For everything." I didn't respond. "I hope someday you can forgive me," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. I met her gaze, my expression hard. "I hope someday you can forgive yourself," I said coldly. She looked like she wanted to say more, but instead, she nodded and got into her car. As she drove away, a strange sense of emptiness settled over me. I'd won. I'd taken back control. But it didn't feel like a victory. Over the next few weeks, I tried to rebuild my life. I threw myself into work, avoiding the quiet of the empty house. Danielle reached out a few more times, but I ignored her. I didn't need another complication. But the nights were the hardest. Alone in the dark, I couldn't escape the memories. The betrayal, the anger, the pain, it all came rushing back, night after night. No matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, Madison's affair had left scars that wouldn't heal. One night, as I sat in the backyard staring at the stars, I realized the truth. There was no happy ending to this story. Madison had destroyed our marriage, and I'd destroyed any chance of reconciliation. In the end, we had both lost. I finished my beer and went inside, the silence of the house swallowing me whole. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the house for good. Somewhere out there, I hoped to find peace. But deep down, I knew it would be a long, lonely road.